the lights always found him. Even as a child, standing in the cramped living room of that small house in Gary, Indiana, Michael Jackson knew what it meant to perform. His father's voice cut through the air like a whip, sharp and unforgiving. Again, Joseph would say, and the boys would start from the top. There was no room for mistakes, no space for weakness. Michael was only 5 years old, but he already understood that his voice was different. It carried something the others didn't have, a raw emotion that made people stop and listen. His brothers were talented, but Michael was special. Everyone knew it, especially his father. Joseph Jackson had dreams bigger than the steel mills where he worked. He saw his sons as tickets out of poverty, and he pushed them with an iron fist. Rehearsals lasted for hours, stretching late into the night. If one of them missed a step or sang off-key, there were consequences. The belt. The shouting. The fear that settled in their bones. Michael learned quickly that perfection wasn't optional. It was survival. While other kids played baseball in the street or rode bikes until sunset, he practiced dance moves until his feet bled. He stared out the window sometimes, watching neighborhood children laugh and chase each other, and wondered what freedom felt like. The Jackson 5 exploded onto the music scene in 1969, and suddenly the whole world knew Michael's name. At 11 years old, he stood center stage, his small frame commanded attention that grown men struggled to achieve. Songs like I Want You Back and ABC topped the charts, and America fell in love with the kid with the big afro and the voice that seemed too powerful for his tiny body. But behind the success, behind the smiles he flashed for cameras and screaming fans, Michael carried a weight that crushed his spirit. He wanted to be normal. He wanted friends who liked him for who he was, not what he could do. He wanted to go to school, play tag, maybe even go to a fair without bodyguards. His brothers got to experience pieces of normalcy, but Michael was different. He was the star, the one everyone wanted to see. That meant more interviews, more photo shoots, more pressure. The industry devoured him. Record executives, managers, and promoters circled like vultures, each one wanting a piece of the golden child. He smiled through it all because that's what was expected. The world needed him to be happy, to be magical, to be the entertainer who never stopped giving. So he became exactly that, even as something inside him began to crack. At night, alone in hotel rooms across the country, Michael would cry into his pillow. He missed his mother's warmth, the feeling of being just a kid. He missed things he'd never actually had. The childhood everyone else took for granted was stolen from him, traded for fortune and fame before he understood what he was losing. His diary entries from those years revealed a boy desperate for connection, for someone to see past the performer and recognize the lonely child underneath. He wrote about wanting to play, wanting to be held without it being a photo opportunity, wanting to matter for something beyond his talent. The seeds of his future pain were planted in those early years. He learned that love was conditional, tied to performance and success. He learned that his value came from what he could give others, not from who he was inside. He learned to hide his tears, to save them for moments when no one was watching. The stage became his prison and his sanctuary, the only place where he felt truly alive, yet the very thing that kept him from living. As Michael grew older, his fame only intensified, but that little boy from Gary never really left. He stayed trapped inside, still crying for the childhood that was taken away, still searching for the innocence he'd lost before he even knew what innocence meant. The year 1982 changed everything. Michael Jackson released Thriller, and the album didn't just break records, it shattered them into pieces so small they could never be put back together. It became the best-selling album of all time, moving over 70 million copies worldwide. Songs like Billie Jean, Beat It, and the title track Thriller dominated radio stations and MTV. Michael wasn't just a pop star anymore. He was a phenomenon, a cultural force that transcended music. The short film for Thriller became an event, a 40-minute masterpiece that proved music videos could be art. His moonwalk debut on the Motown 25 television special left audiences speechless. In that moment, he defied gravity and logic, gliding backwards across the stage like something not quite human. But perfection demanded sacrifice. Michael's obsession with his craft consumed every waking moment. He spent months in the studio, working on songs until they reached an impossible standard. He'd record vocals dozens of times, searching for that perfect take that existed only in his mind. He studied every frame of his videos, critiquing his movements with brutal honesty. If a dance step wasn't sharp enough, he'd rehearse it hundreds of times. If a note didn't soar the way he heard it in his head, he'd go back to the booth. His collaborators marveled at his dedication, but they also worried. The man was driving himself into the ground, chasing a perfection that always stayed just out of reach. The world celebrated his genius while he suffered in silence. Awards piled up, Grammys, American Music Awards, recognition from every corner of the globe. Michael smiled for the cameras, held his trophies high, and delivered humble acceptance speeches. But inside, he felt hollow. The praise never filled the void. The applause faded as soon as he left the stage. He'd return to his hotel suite, surrounded by gold records and accolades, and feel completely alone. Fame had become a monster that fed on his soul, demanding more and more until there was nothing left to give. He couldn't walk down a street without being mobbed. He couldn't trust new people because everyone wanted something from him. His life became a series of secured locations and planned exits, a prison made of success. The pressure to follow up Thriller was crushing. How do you top the biggest album in history? Michael felt the eyes of the world watching, waiting to see if he could do it again. The weight of expectation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. He began changing his appearance, undergoing plastic surgery that he'd later admit became an addiction. His nose got smaller and smaller with each procedure. His skin gradually lightened, which he attributed to vitiligo, a condition that destroys skin pigment, though the public speculated and gossiped endlessly. He was trying to reshape himself, to become something that matched the impossible image in his mind. The tabloids turned vicious. They called him Wacko Jacko, a nickname he despised with every fiber of his being. They wrote stories about him sleeping in a hyperbaric chamber to live longer, about him trying to buy the bones of the Elephant Man. Some of these stories had tiny grains of truth twisted beyond recognition, others were complete fabrications. Michael tried to ignore them, but the lies cut deep. He was sensitive, more vulnerable than people realized. Each cruel headline felt like a personal attack on his humanity. The media had decided he was weird, and they were going to prove it no matter what he did. His relationships suffered. Trusting people became impossible when everyone had a price, when former friends sold stories to tabloids for quick cash. He retreated further into isolation, surrounding himself with yes-men and employees rather than genuine friends. He bought Neverland Ranch in 1987, creating his own private world complete with amusement park rides, a zoo, and a movie theater. It was his attempt to build the childhood he never had, a place where he could finally feel free. But even there, in his own paradise, loneliness followed him like a shadow. The ride sat empty most days. The animals in the zoo were the closest things he had to unconditional companions. Michael's pain became fuel for his art. Songs like Man in the Mirror carried deep messages about change and self-reflection. Leave Me Alone directly addressed the media's obsession with his personal life. His music videos grew more elaborate and expensive, each one a statement piece. He was pouring his suffering into his work, transforming agony into art that millions connected with. But the transformation cost him pieces of himself. Each album, each tour, each public appearance chipped away at the man behind the mask, leaving only the performer, the moonwalking, glove-wearing, gravity-defying icon that the world demanded he be. The nightmare began in August 1993. A 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler accused Michael Jackson of sexual abuse, and the world Michael had built began to crumble. The allegations were explosive, dominating headlines across every newspaper and television station. Michael denied everything, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and devastation. He'd opened his home to countless children over the years, kids battling cancer, poverty, and disease. His relationship with children was something he considered pure, innocent, a connection to the childhood he'd lost. Now that connection was being twisted into something monstrous. The media circus reached levels of insanity that few had ever witnessed. Helicopters followed Michael's every movement. Reporters camped outside Neverland Ranch for weeks, desperate for any scrap of information. Former employees came forward with stories, some credible, others clearly motivated by money. The public divided sharply. Fans stood by him fiercely, organizing protests and wearing t-shirts declaring his innocence. Others, convinced by the relentless media coverage, had already decided he was guilty. The presumption of innocence meant nothing in the court of public opinion. The investigation was humiliating beyond measure. Police obtained a search warrant for Neverland, combing through his private sanctuary like crime scene investigators. They photographed Michael's body, documenting marks and characteristics to compare with the accuser's description. The violation of his dignity was complete. Here was a man who'd spent his entire life being stared at, analyzed, and judged, now subjected to the ultimate invasion of privacy. Michael felt his soul being ripped apart. He trusted people, opened his heart, and now he was being punished for kindness. His health deteriorated rapidly. The stress triggered a dependency on prescription painkillers that had started years earlier after a stage accident left him with chronic back pain. Now he used them to numb more than physical suffering. He cancelled the remainder of his dangerous world tour, citing dehydration and exhaustion, but those close to him knew the truth. He was breaking down. The constant scrutiny, the accusations, the feeling that the entire world had turned against him, it was too much. He checked into a rehabilitation facility, admitting his addiction publicly. Even this vulnerable moment was picked apart by critics who saw it as a publicity stunt rather than a genuine cry for help. In January 1994, Michael settled the civil lawsuit with the Chandler family for an amount reported to be over $20 million. He maintained his innocence, stating he settled to avoid a long, drawn-out trial that would further destroy his life. The decision haunted him. Many people interpreted the settlement as an admission of guilt. If he was innocent, why pay? But Michael's lawyers had advised him that fighting could take years and cost even more, both financially and emotionally. No criminal charges were filed, largely because the key witness was no longer cooperating after the civil settlement. For Michael, it felt like losing even when there was no conviction. His reputation had been shredded. The man who'd brought joy to billions was now associated with the worst possible crime. The accusations changed him fundamentally. The openness that had defined his personality vanished. He became paranoid, suspicious of everyone's motives. Neverland, once his refuge, now felt tainted. The innocent joy he'd felt playing with children evaporated, replaced by fear and caution. He understood that any interaction could be misinterpreted, weaponized, used to destroy him. His music during this period reflected his anguish. The album History, Past, Present and Future, book I released in 1995, contained songs like Scream and They Don't Care About Us, angry, defiant tracks that showed a man fighting back against a world that had betrayed him. His personal relationships became increasingly complicated. He married Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis, in a union many suspected was a publicity move to improve his image. They divorced less than 2 years later. He then married Debbie Rowe, a dermatology nurse, who gave birth to his first 2 children. That marriage also ended in divorce. Michael's ability to form genuine connections had been damaged beyond repair. Everyone wanted something from him, or they wanted to hurt him. Trust became impossible. Love became transactional. Despite everything, Michael continued creating. Music was his therapy, his salvation, the one place where he still felt in control. He recorded songs about injustice, about pain, about hope. His performances remained electric, proof that whatever demons tormented him offstage, onstage he was still the king of pop. But the joy was gone. When he danced, you could see the effort behind each move, the weariness in his eyes. He was going through the motions, giving audiences what they expected while dying inside. The trial of his life wasn't in a courtroom, it was the daily battle to keep living when the world had decided you were guilty. Michael Jackson's final decade was a study in contradictions, moments of resilience punctuated by devastating lows. In 2003, another accusation emerged, this time from a boy named Gavin Arvizo. The charges were similar to the 1993 allegations, and Michael's world imploded once again. This time, however, there would be no settlement. Prosecutors from Santa Barbara County, led by District Attorney Tom Snedon, who seemed to have a personal vendetta against Michael, pushed for a criminal trial. The case went to court in 2005, and for 5 months, Michael faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The trial was a spectacle that rivaled any entertainment Michael had ever produced, except this time he wasn't in control. Every day, he arrived at the courthouse wearing different outfits, sometimes elaborate suits, other times pajama bottoms when his health failed him. The prosecution painted him as a predator who'd used his fame to lure vulnerable children. They paraded witnesses who told stories of inappropriate behavior, of Jesus juice served in soda cans, of secret alarms that warned of approaching adults. The defense countered with evidence of the accuser's family attempting to extort money from celebrities before, with testimonies that tore apart the prosecution's timeline. Michael sat through it all, growing thinner and more fragile with each passing day. The stress was killing him slowly. He barely ate, surviving on minimal sleep and maximum anxiety. His children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were his only source of light during those dark months. He'd hidden them from the public eye their entire lives, sometimes covering their faces with masks and veils to give them the privacy he'd never had. They were his purpose, his reason to keep fighting. The thought of being separated from them, of dying in prison away from the only pure love he'd ever known, terrified him more than any stage fright ever had. On June 13, 2005, the jury returned with their verdict. Not guilty on all 14 counts. Michael wept as the words were read, his body shaking with relief and exhaustion. He'd been vindicated in a court of law, but the victory felt hollow. The damage was irreversible. His reputation would never fully recover. Millions still believed he was guilty despite the acquittal. The trial had cost him tens of millions in legal fees. Neverland, which had been raided again during the investigation, was now a place of trauma rather than joy. He never lived there again after the trial ended. Financial problems mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Michael had spent money as freely as he'd earned it throughout his career, purchasing expensive art, supporting dozens of relatives, maintaining Neverland's enormous operational costs. His spending habits were legendary and unsustainable. By 2008, he was hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Neverland faced foreclosure. The Beatles' catalog he'd wisely purchased in 1985 was one of his few remaining valuable assets, but even that wasn't enough to cover his obligations. The king of pop was broke, a reality that seemed impossible given his legendary status. His physical appearance had changed dramatically over the years. The plastic surgeries had continued, leaving his face looking increasingly unnatural. His nose had been operated on so many times that it required prosthetics. His skin was pale, a result of vitiligo but also skin bleaching treatments he'd undergone to even out the blotchy appearance the disease caused. The pain medication dependency that started in 1993 had evolved into a full-blown addiction. He used prescription drugs to sleep, to wake up, to numb physical pain, and to escape emotional torment. Doctors who should have protected him instead enabled his addiction, prescribing whatever he asked for as long as the checks cleared. In 2009, facing financial ruin, Michael announced a comeback. This Is It would be a series of 50 concerts at London's O2 Arena, a residency that would re-establish him as the world's greatest performer. The announcement sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Tickets sold out in hours, breaking records. Fans who'd supported him through scandals and silence were ready to see their idol return to glory. Michael threw himself into rehearsals with the intensity that had defined his younger years, but his body couldn't keep up with his ambition. He was 50 years old, weighed barely more than 100 pounds, and was dependent on drugs to function. Behind closed doors, the people around him grew increasingly worried. Dancers and musicians noticed he seemed disoriented during rehearsals. He'd forget lyrics to songs he'd performed thousands of times. His movements, once sharp and precise, were sluggish. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was administering propofol, a powerful anesthetic meant only for surgical procedures, to help Michael sleep. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely inappropriate for home use. But Michael was desperate for rest, for peace, for an escape from the thoughts that tortured him in the quiet hours. His children were growing up, and he was determined to give them everything he'd never had: normalcy, privacy, unconditional love. He cooked them breakfast, helped with homework, took them to bookstores and toy shops. When they were with him, his face would light up with genuine happiness. They were his redemption, his second chance to do things right. Prince was 12, Paris was 11, and Blanket was 7. They adored their father, seeing past the tabloid monster to the gentle, loving man who sang them lullabies and told them bedtime stories. Michael wanted desperately to live for them, to show them that despite everything the world had thrown at him, he'd survived. June 25, 2009, started like any other day of preparation for the greatest comeback in music history. Michael Jackson was at his rented mansion in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, running through last-minute details for This Is It. The tour was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind raced with creative possibilities. He'd barely slept in days, his insomnia reaching critical levels. Dr. Conrad Murray had been staying at the house, administering various sedatives to help Michael rest. That morning, nothing was working. The medications that usually knocked him out were ineffective against the anxiety consuming him. Michael begged Murray for propofol, the drug he called his milk because of its white appearance. He'd been using it for years as a sleep aid, despite its dangers. Murray, who was being paid $150,000 per month, complied. He set up an 4-drip, administered the drug, and then, fatally, left Michael alone. Propofol requires constant monitoring. Patients need to be watched for any sign of respiratory distress. Murray stepped away to make phone calls, leaving Michael unattended for approximately 2 hours. During that time, Michael Jackson stopped breathing. When Murray finally checked on him, Michael had no pulse. Panic set in. Murray began CPR, but he was performing it incorrectly, doing chest compressions on Michael while he was still on the soft bed rather than moving him to the floor. He waited precious minutes before calling 911, and when he finally did, he didn't mention the propofol. Paramedics arrived to find Michael in full cardiac arrest. They worked on him desperately, shocking his heart, administering drugs, trying everything to bring him back. His body was still warm, but life had already left. They transported him to UCLA Medical Center, continuing resuscitation efforts in the ambulance, but it was futile. At 2:26 p.m., Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. The news spread across the world faster than any hit song he'd ever released. Television networks interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. Twitter crashed from the volume of posts. Fans gathered outside the hospital, outside his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, outside Neverland. They cried, they sang his songs, they held vigil for the man who'd soundtracked their lives. The outpouring of grief was global and immediate. Michael had been controversial, complicated, and troubled, but he'd also been beloved in ways few humans ever experience. His 3 children were told their father was gone. Paris, just 11 years old, screamed until her voice gave out. Prince tried to be strong, the oldest child taking on responsibility beyond his years. Blanket, only 7, couldn't fully comprehend that Daddy wasn't coming home. They'd lost their protector, their entire world. Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, took custody of the children, promising to raise them with the love and stability Michael had always wanted for them. The investigation into Michael's death began immediately, with Dr. Murray at the center of scrutiny. The memorial service held at the Staples Center on July 7, 2009, was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide. Stars from every corner of entertainment spoke about Michael's genius, his generosity, and his troubled life. But it was Paris Jackson who delivered the most heartbreaking moment. The little girl who'd been shielded from public view her entire life stepped to the microphone, her voice trembling. "Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And I just want to say I love him so much." The world collectively broke, seeing the human cost of the spectacle Michael's life had become. Dr. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter. His trial in 2011 revealed the reckless circumstances of Michael's death, the inappropriate drugs, the lack of proper monitoring equipment, the delayed emergency call. Murray was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he served only 2. For many, the sentence seemed insignificant compared to the loss. Michael Jackson was gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. Murray became the scapegoat, but the truth was more complicated. Michael's death was the result of decades of pain, exploitation, addiction, and a system that enabled rather than helped him. In death, Michael found something that had eluded him in life: peace and universal appreciation. The allegations that had haunted him faded from immediate discussion, replaced by celebration of his artistic contributions. His music sales skyrocketed. This Is It, a documentary made from rehearsal footage, became the highest-grossing concert film of all time. New generations discovered his catalog, dancing to Thriller and Billie Jean without the baggage of scandal. Michael had wanted desperately to be remembered for his art rather than his personal struggles, and in death, he finally was. His children grew up, navigating life without their father but carrying his legacy. Paris became an actress and model, speaking openly about mental health struggles and the pain of losing her dad. Prince graduated from college and started his own entertainment career. Blanket, later known as Bye Guy, chose a more private life. They all defended their father's memory fiercely, rejecting the allegations and narratives that sought to define him by his worst moments rather than his best. Michael Jackson's story is ultimately a tragedy wrapped in glitter and moonwalks. He was a boy who never got to be a child, forced to perform before he could choose his own path. He was a genius who created music that transcended language and culture, bringing joy to billions while finding none for himself. He was a man who loved deeply but struggled to trust, who gave everything to his art and had everything taken from him in return. The smile he showed the world masked tears that never stopped falling. He danced for us, sang for us, entertained us with every ounce of his being, and we consumed him until there was nothing left. The lights that had always found him finally went dark, and the silence after the music stopped echoed with everything he'd wanted to say but never could. Michael Jackson spent his life crying in silence, and only in death did he finally escape the stage that had imprisoned him since childhood.